Hello, everybody. Welcome into DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. My name is Brandon Adams. We have a fun conversation coming up in just a moment with DawgNation's Connor Riley. A little bit of a preview of more of what we'll do this afternoon at 3 p.m. with another edition of Cover 4 Live with Connor, myself, DawgNation's Mike Griffith, and our recruiting insider, Jeff Sintel. I'll have to set up what we're going to talk about with Connor, at least part of what we're going to talk about here in just a moment. So we'll do that. Let me also remind you that we're brought to you today by our friends at Merriweather and Tharp. You know, they are your source for Georgia divorce. And let's face it, divorce is a part of life for some people. Statistically speaking, a good number of the people listening in our audience right now either have dealt with this or unfortunately will have to deal with this sometime there in the future. Not a lot you can do about that. Sometimes relationships just become irreparable. Well, if you find yourself in that situation, I can't necessarily make what's happened in the past better, but I can make the future look better for you. That's when you have an advocate on your side like my friends at Merriweather and Tharp. Bob, Jason, the whole team over there are famous for the work they do to help you rebuild your life, whether it be your relationship with your children, your finances, whatever else. They have been through this thousands of times. The expertise they've gained through that time can be put to work for you. And by the way, you don't even have to be a client of Merriweather and Tharp to necessarily benefit from the expertise they bring to the table. They have all kinds of free blog posts, podcasts, just all kinds of conversation starters to give you the information you may need to ask better questions once you do have that initial consultation. So if you find yourself in the midst of a season when you are looking at divorce, I'm sorry for you on that. But take my advice, reach out to my friends at Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. You can find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. All right, let me, before I bring in Connor Riley, sort of remind you what we talked about yesterday. So I talked about the 5 players yesterday who I thought were the swing players that could determine whether or not Georgia wins a national championship or not. And the 5 that I selected were all draft eligible on the basis of 3 stipulations. One of the stipulations was that Georgia would have plenty of major contributions from elite freshmen and sophomores, much the same way that LSU did this past season. The other stipulation that I gave you was that I thought that Georgia probably already had 4 players likely to be selected in the first 3 rounds of the upcoming NFL draft. And then, by upcoming, I mean a year from now. And then the third stipulation I gave you is that I'm pretty certain after a nice track record of the last 3 years that the Georgia offensive line performance is essentially a given. A lot of new names, new offensive line coach, but my assumption was that Georgia fans can expect a good performance from the offensive line here in the 2020 season. However, there's some new news out there today, or at least some new opinions, that causes me to wonder, did I speak too soon in terms of considering the Georgia offensive line as a given for the upcoming season? Specifically this. Our friend Barrett Sallee from CBSSports.com has got his projections for the upcoming season up online, and he's got Georgia actually finishing second in the SEC East, even though Barrett's, I think, picked Georgia to win the SEC for a few years in a row here. Going with them as second right now, 10-2, losing to Florida. And one of the reasons that he cites is the uncertainty for the Georgia offensive line after Thomas and Wilson, Solomon Kinley are gone, and obviously Sam Pittman is on his way to be Arkansas head coach. I don't necessarily agree with Barrett's assessment on this. I still feel pretty confident in the Georgia offensive line for the upcoming season, but it's at least a topic worth considering. So with that in mind, let me bring in Connor Riley from DawgNation.com. Connor, so you hear me kind of set this up a bit. You know, I've said when I'm projecting the upcoming year to kind of get to the players that might matter, those swing players that could determine the outcome for Georgia, you have to stipulate a couple things at the beginning. And one of my stipulations is that I believe that the Georgia offensive line will still be one of this team's strengths, even though guys like Thomas and Wilson and Kinley are gone. Do you think I'm speaking too soon in assuming that the Georgia offensive line has got a track record that makes it trustworthy? I'm actually not hearing Connor. I don't know if that's just on my end. Oh, there we go. Yeah, go ahead, Connor.
Sorry, user error on my end.
No worries.
I think the Georgia offensive line is still going to be good. It's still going to be competent, but you don't get better, or you don't not experience some drop off when you lose a 3-year starter in Andrew Thomas and a 2-year guy in Isaiah Wilson to go along with Solomon Kinley as well. Now, they do have some guys that have played. They have some guys who have some nice upside that have not played a whole lot. Jamari Sire really comes to mind there. I think Trey Hill is only going to continue to get better as a center, and they're bringing in some young talent. I think Broderick Jones is a guy who in normal circumstances would be someone we'd be talking a lot more about, but I think given the current situation, I do wonder he might be just given he has to put on weight at the next level. I think he's someone who, if there's an interruption of summer workouts and he's maybe, arriving to campus a little bit later than he usually would, I think he's probably a guy who's most impacted by all of this. But the Georgia offensive line is still going to be very good. Justin Schaefer's played significant amount of football. Ben Cleveland has played significant amount of football. And then you have guys like Warren Erickson and Jamari Sawyer, who, when they played against Baylor, the best defense in the Big 12 a year ago, they played pretty well for the most part. So while the Georgia offensive line, it's not going to be the best part of the team this year, like it maybe was perhaps for the offense last year, I think in the long run that might actually be okay, because you're going to need some other parts of this offense to step up anyway in 2020.
Yeah, when I say the Georgia offensive line is going to be fine, let me tell you what I hope that I'm not doing. I hope I'm not making the same mistake that I made a year ago. And I've admitted this, that when I looked at like the math guys and some of the more statistically minded college football analysts who were saying that Georgia's lack of returning production at wide receiver had the potential to be a really big problem, my essential response to that is, I hear what you're saying and I see your numbers, but what you don't realize is the overwhelming amount of talent that Georgia has is going to prevent that from being a problem. In retrospect, that was a mistake to think that inexperienced talent could basically prevent something that had been a problem for so many other teams for also being a problem for Georgia. The results spoke for themselves. Georgia was very much in line with other teams who've had that little returning production at wide receiver. I underestimated the degree to which that could be a problem for UGA. I don't think I'm doing the same thing, though, when I talk about the Georgia offensive line, for one simple reason. Ultimately, what hurt Georgia last year with its wide receivers was not so much a lack of production from 2018 returning as it was a lack of track record after year after year after year. The Georgia wide receiver corps has been a little bit of a, even with some names we all know and love, has been a little bit of an uneven group now, even predating Kirby Smart. It's just been uneven what you expect to get from that group. Whereas I think the performance of the Georgia offensive line now, going back at least 3 years, is solid enough that you can make a projection about the position group and the individual positions. Even if right now I don't feel confident in being able to name all 5 of the starters there, I at least know what I get from left guard. I at least know what I get from right guard. I at least know what I get from one of the tackle spots, because there's now a track record in place for that position group. Does that distinction make a difference to you, and does it make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I think looking back, and this is probably something we should have harped on maybe a little bit more a year ago, Georgia had not recruited the wide receiver position all that well. That's right. And I think we let the additions of George Pickens and Dominic Blaylock, who were the best wide receivers Georgia had recruited in essentially a decade, sort of blind us, cloud our judgment a little bit, that the reality was they had not recruited and developed that position as well as they had year over year. Whereas the offensive line, I think bar none to this point in Kirby Smart's tenure, has not only been the most consistent position group in his tenure, but the best recruited position group. You have multiple 5-stars in every class. You have guys like Clay Webb, who isn't even really expected to play a whole lot this year, but he's a guy who would play, I think, for a lot of college football programs, a place like Auburn, a place like Florida that need more offensive line help. I think that's, an example of this guy's going to struggle to just get on the field here at Georgia this year. And that should give you some belief that Georgia is going to be okay. I think if there's one question, it's going to be who fills in at that tackle spot opposite Jamari Sawyer. I think you and I both feel comfortable, whether it be at the right tackle spot or the left tackle spot, as Solomon Kinley told us last week with Sawyer. It's who is that guy that fills in opposite him? Is it Broderick Jones? Is it Warren McClendon? Is it Xavier Truss? Guys who, we've had different Georgia offensive linemen all speak highly of, but until we sort of see them on the field, that's the biggest question mark with this position group right now.
Let me make one more point about the offensive line, then we'll move on and kind of talk about something else for a moment. I want to be careful how I say this, but when I look at the last 3 years for Georgia, 2017, 18, and 19, the only one of those 3 years in which I thought Georgia had an undisputably great offensive line was 2018. The 2017 offensive line was good enough. The 2019 offensive line was good enough. The 2019 offensive line I thought was elite from a pass protection standpoint. But frankly, and I want to be very careful how I say this because I don't want to disparage the guys, but it's not that hard to match what the 2019 offensive line did for Georgia from a run game standpoint, opening up holes in the running game. This offensive line a year ago simply was not great at that. Now, you may say there were some mitigating factors, predictable play calling, things like that. You're probably right to say that. However, I'm not asking the 2020 offensive line to be the greatest offensive line in the history of college football. I'm asking them to match what previous Georgia offensive lines have done. And from a run game standpoint last year, it may not be quite as hard to match that feat as some people might think it is.
Right. And I think the big difference from 2018 and 2019 is just I don't necessarily think everyone appreciated how good Lamont Galliard was, especially at getting to the next level and sort of opening things up there. And because last year was Trey Hill's first time ever in high school or in college is playing starting center. And I do think there were some growing pains there with him. Now, he's played more football there at that spot. He's certainly more comfortable at that center spot going into this year. But and again, I think the other thing is, you probably feel maybe a little bit better about the wide receiver position this year than you did a year ago. Well, you don't have a DeAndre Swift back there at running back. The depth is still good. So I actually think, even if the offensive line does take a step back just from great to good, I think there's perhaps enough talent around Georgia to where that difference isn't all that much noticeable.
Hey, I want to take a quick moment to shout out my friends at the UGA Alumni Association, the great work they're doing right now, facilitating the kind of money necessary to continue to make UGA really one of the shining institutions in all of higher learning. There's a lot of ways in which you can support what's happening at UGA right now, and I'll make sure that you're aware of all of that, whether it be the Student Emergency Fund. Let's face it, for a lot of students right now, displaced, not able to be on campus, going back to their hometowns, living with their families again, a lot of those students kind of find themselves in very unusual situations, whether it be because of loss of job for the family that takes care of them, or uncertain health situation because of what we're battling with the COVID-19 virus right now. Well, the Student Emergency Fund is put in place for moments just like this, and your support of the Student Emergency Fund gets right into the hands of UGA students who just need a little bit of help from time to time, a little bit of a pick-me-up, sort of keep them on the educational track. We're all made better when students like this get their UGA degree. Your contribution to the Student Emergency Fund enables that to continue to happen, and these students will eventually go out and change the world they're going to be a part of. You can also support the research being done by UGA scientists as we seek a vaccine or a therapeutic for COVID-19. Great work is being done at the University of Georgia. In fact, you may have actually read about some of the breakthroughs recently that have occurred there at UGA. Well, this kind of research, these kinds of advancements don't happen without money. Your donation makes all that possible there as well. Also, for students about to graduate, they find themselves entering into a job market that's pretty tenuous right now, and it's very uncertain. When you step up to be a mentor, you help guide them through that phase and help them get on their feet to begin life sort of as a post-UGA grad, a very important thing to be able to do. Plus, so many of you are on the front lines, you're in your own way, battling against COVID-19. The UGA Alumni Association would love to be able to hear your story on that there as well. So let me give you a website to go to. I'll see it a couple times, although for those of you on video, it's easier to read on the screen. It's alumni.uga.edu/COVID-19. Once again, that's alumni.uga.edu/COVID-19. All right, Connor, let me bring you in on the conversation we had yesterday. And I want to try to sum this up really quickly because I want to get a response from you. So what I stipulated yesterday was good offensive line, really good freshmen and sophomores. LSU's the perfect example of this. Some of their truly elite players a year ago are not draft eligible for 2020. Jamar Chase, Derek Stingley, guys like that. The other stipulation that I made is I think that Georgia already has 4 players likely to be taken in the first 3 rounds of the 2021 draft. New in the quarterback, 3 defensive backs, Stokes, Campbell, and Richard LeCounte, if Campbell were to choose to leave. I believe that those 4 guys can be top 3 round picks. And when you see LSU this past year, 10 players selected in the first 3 rounds for the reigning national champion, that means that Georgia's got to find some other draft-eligible guys for the upcoming season to really break through, to really step up. I'm not asking anybody to be, College Football Hall of Famer, just a better statistical performance. The 5 names I gave our audience yesterday, 2 guys on offense, Zamir White, Demetrius Robertson, 3 guys on defense, Jermaine Johnson, Azeez Ojulari, and Jordan Davis, the defensive tackle. If those guys take not dramatic improvements, I'm not asking Jermaine Johnson to be Chase Young, but as I said before, could he give Georgia what LSU got from Clavon Chasen? I'm not asking Azeez Ojulari to be Chase Young either, but could he be as good as Yader Gross-Matos was for Penn State, 9.5 sacks, for instance? I'm asking for incremental improvement from these guys. That's my 5. How does that land with you?
I think those names all make sense. If I could add in a few other names here and there, I think on the offensive side of the ball, I think Trey McKitty could be an interesting guy. You saw what LSU got out of LSU has not been known as a tight end factory. I largely think outside of Penn State and Notre Dame, tight end factories at the college level don't really exist. But LSU got a lot out of Thaddeus Moss a season ago, and that did, I think, help unlock part of their offense and sort of take guys away from the outsides of the field where Chase, Terrence Marshall were sort of able to thrive. And I think if Trey McKitty is able to do that and have success at Georgia this year, again, he has a body type that Georgia just has not traditionally had at that tight end position. He's perhaps a little bit more athletic than both Charlie Warner and Isaac Nauta were at that tight end spot. And I think if Georgia's able to get something out of him and make him into a productive player, maybe not a top 3-round draft pick, but a 4th, 5th rounder, I certainly think that helps open things up there.
Before you mention another player, let me respond to McKitty, because I want to hear the rest of your guys. Let me respond to McKitty. I think there's something very interesting about him. And I'm not saying that he's going to be as good for Georgia as Lawrence Cager was a year ago, but there's an element of McKitty that reminds me of Cager. When you look at Lawrence, there were a lot of people who said at Miami, well, you got to understand, here was a guy that had some, I guess, drops problems. There was kind of an uneven evaluation of Cager's time at Miami, and yet there were certain stats where you said, wow, one thing's pretty sure. He's catching touchdowns. He's pretty active, involved in that offense. For a team that wasn't great, Cager seemed to kind of assert himself. I think there's a very similar thing with McKitty here as well. Florida State was a mess and has been now for a couple of years. And we've had guys that know the situation in Tallahassee on this show. And they've kind of offered also kind of well, there's a good side and a bad side when it comes to McKitty there at Florida State. And yet a little bit of a deeper look at the numbers suggests this was a guy involved in that offense. So I think comparing him to Thaddeus Moss is interesting, but also kind of looking at the fact that on a bad team that didn't have a lot going for it, Trey McKitty found a way to get himself used in that offense, and that's at least worth consideration if you're a UGA fan.
Right. In the situation he steps into at Georgia, there's infinitely more stability here than there has been in his time at Florida State. And I think that might allow him to sort of just focus on just the aspects of playing football and doing the best he can this season, whereas in past years, he's maybe worried about coaching turnover. What's my spot going to be like here with the new coaching staff coming in? And where's my sort of stability within this program? Whereas I think at Georgia, he actually gets that. As far as some other guys, I 100% agree on Azeez Ojulari. I'm going to have probably something this weekend on guys who could sort of be that like Andrew Thomas type player, a guy who, obviously Azeez redshirted, but a guy who makes strong contributions as a freshman and just gets better every year. And while he might not be the best athlete in the world, he's someone who's just a very solid football player, and that should attract NFL teams. And I think Azeez is certainly going to be that. Whether it's whether he chooses to leave out of this 2021 for the 2021 draft or even the 2022 draft, I think that'll be worth watching. And I could also see, before I mention my other guy, I could also see DJ Daniel as a second, third round pick. I don't think he's going to test as well athletically as Stokes and Campbell, but he's going to be, I think, a very good player for Georgia.
His straight line speed should be really good, though, right?
I think so. How does Monty Rice not get mentioned?
Okay.
He is I believe this is his 3rd year as a starter, or is it 3rd year as a big-time contributor. You're not asking him to be Roquan Smith, but I still think he's going to be a very good player for this Georgia defense, very solid player. And, playing next to a guy like Nakobe Dean, who can do a lot of the athleticism things, I think that could really make Monty Rice a really, really good player for the Georgia defense this year.
So Mike Griffith, when he was with us yesterday, also mentioned Monty Rice, and it could be that I'm just in error by omitting Monty. Let me try to explain kind of what my thought process was. First of all, 5 is a better number than 6. It just sort of sounds. Yeah. It just sort of sounds better.
We both write headlines for a living.
Right. So there's partially that, but even beyond that, I like what Monty does for Georgia already. I think of Monty as an elite run stopper, the same way that I think of Jordan Davis as like the version of that, the defensive line. The guy kind of right behind him. You know how like in baseball they say you want to be strong up the middle, catcher, shortstop, second baseman, center fielder. Georgia's sort of strong up the middle with Davis and then Monty Rice kind of lining up behind him. So it's not like I'm looking for a huge statistical improvement from Monty because I sort of already like what he does. Now, does Monty Rice go in the first 3 rounds because of that? Maybe he does. Maybe I'm not giving him enough credit for saying that. I'll certainly acknowledge that. But the reason why I include a guy like Davis where I don't include a guy like Monty, and this may not be the sound reasoning, it's just my own personal reasoning. I said yesterday that I don't expect Jordan Davis to be Derrick Brown. I think they're very different kinds of players.
Yeah.
But coming out of high school, Jordan Davis' recruiting profile is not wildly different than Javon Kinlaw's was. And I'm not expecting Jordan Davis to sack quarterbacks as well as Kinlaw did at South Carolina, although Davis did have 2.5 a year ago, probably more than some people realize. But my question on Jordan Davis was, is there a chance that he has a similar tackle for loss number to what Kinlaw showed the ability to do at South Carolina? I think that Georgia's been woefully inadequate in terms of producing tackles for loss anyway. I think that Davis is one of those guys, hopefully in really good shape, hopefully ready to show off an additional level of athleticism where he's already great as a run-stop defensive lineman. In the SEC, you have to have that. But there's this statistical threshold that he could also sort of break through where all of a sudden this guy's making tackles behind the line of scrimmage a little bit more. That's my reason for choosing Davis over Rice. It may not be the soundest of reasons, but it is my reason.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the thing Davis does best is he literally clogs up the middle. He is the swab of hair that is clogging up your drain, that is filling up your bathtub. And Georgia, just with the way they use their defensive linemen, other than Tyler Clark last year, really, they traditionally have not had their defensive linemen just say, hey, I know we preach gap integrity football, but just go make a play. They just have not really done that with the defensive linemen. And I actually think in this upcoming season, if there's going to be a guy to do that, it wouldn't necessarily be Davis because he allows guys like Monty Rice and guys like potentially Nakobe Dean to go make those plays. I think if it's a defensive lineman, it's Trayvon Walker, just because I think like Davis, he does have that unique size and athleticism, but he plays perhaps a spot where he's asked to do a little bit less in terms of holding his ground and be put in a potentially better playmaking spot for Georgia.
Oh, before we go, I want to ask you about the column you wrote this morning. Any other players you want to mention before we get there?
No, I think we've pretty much hit on the guys that we all mentioned. I'll be really interested to see what we get out of Demetrius Robertson this year. It's one of those things. I largely kind of think he is what he is at this point. He's a solid player, but I don't think he'll also ever live up to being that, 5-star wide receiver that we all thought he was, as a high school recruit, and then when he ultimately transferred into Georgia.
Okay, so let's mention D-Rob for a moment, and then I promise we'll move on. So here's what I said about D-Rob yesterday. I'm not asking him to be Jerry Jeudy, but could he be Henry Ruggs? Henry Ruggs was 757 yards a year ago and 7 touchdowns. Now, Ruggs has also been 700-plus 2 years in a row at Alabama, so he's clearly more comfortable and a part of the Bama offense than Robertson has been at UGA. But Robertson had 700-plus receiving yards in his freshman year at Cal, different conference, different offense, totally understand that. Robertson also caught 3 touchdowns a year ago, so it's not like he hasn't found the end zone in his Georgia career. Is it asking too much in an offense that's going to include Pickens and Blaylock and at least one major freshman contributor? Could Demetrius Robertson have 700-plus receiving yards and at least more touchdowns than he had this past year?
No, I don't think so. And if he does, I think we're doing backflips because I do think that means, Pickens is having a greater statistical season. I think you're seeing nice things out of Blaylock and freshman wide receiver X. And at this point in the show, I feel obligated to give the commenters their Matt Landers, Tommy Bush, Kyrus Jackson mentions as well.
Sure, of course.
But with D-Rob, to steal the Michael Jordan phrase, I mean, this is his last dance. It's his last year at Georgia, and there's been a ton of hype and a ton of talk around him. And, while he has done some positive things before, I still think the thing with him is, he's always seems like a guy who's had like an injury or two, and that has been a reason he's been slowed down for whatever reason. And if he can just, I think, sort of like McKitty, he's really got stability now in sort of knowing what he is and what he's going to be. And I think that might potentially free him up to make a few more plays for the Georgia passing offense this year.
Last thing before we let you go, you wrote this morning at DawgNation.com about what Kirby Smart's on the Paul Feinbaum show. I agree with your premise that, I do think we're seeing a greater gap starting to grow in terms of what Sunbelt teams are doing, not the Sunbelt Conference, but teams kind of in this part of the country, SEC teams, in terms of, the NFL draft just accentuates this even more. There's just a huge gap talent-wise right now in college football, and it may only expand as time goes on. But let me also bring you on the other part of this when it comes to Kirby doing what I believe was, a sort of a veiled shot in the direction of Dabo Swinney and Clemson. I think all is fair in this regard. And I hope people understand this, that as a UGA fan, I'm not incapable of showing respect for UGA rivals. I've actually got respect for what Dabo and Clemson have done, not only winning games in the field, but Dabo's created a substantial brand, the kind of program that's a little bit more fun-loving, that's a little bit more family-oriented seemingly than, like, say, what an Alabama program is. And I think that you've got to do everything you can to take that brand down a peg if you're a program like Georgia. So kind of accusing them of being soft or accusing them of wanting to feast on soft competition, I just think is fair if you're trying to sort of distinguish yourself in comparison to Clemson. On the full scale of things, what did you make of what Smart said Friday in the Fine Bomb Show?
Yeah, I certainly think it was directed at Clemson. I think that's a team, especially when you look at schools that are having the most success in the Atlanta area, which I think Kirby Smart has made a newer, more tried to make a bigger part of the Georgia recruiting machine. Clemson is undoubtedly probably the team that has had the most success in that area in recent years on a consistent basis. So I do think that this is probably him, throwing a brushback pitch a little bit and saying like, hey, there are teams out there doing this. But to your larger point there, I've been rewatching The Wire all in the game. It's the game of recruiting. Sometimes, while Georgia, Clemson, Ohio State, these schools all have great things to tout about themselves in each unique and different ways. At the end of the day, sometimes you got to sling mud too. And I think Clemson is certainly doing that and has done so. And if you're a Clemson standpoint, it's pretty easy and pretty easy to sell. Hey, you go play in the SEC at a place like Georgia, Alabama, LSU. It's not guaranteed you get to the SEC title game and they're just playing for a conference title. Whereas Clemson, you win 12 games a year in the regular season, cakewalk to the ACC title game. You're in a college football playoff. You're in those big games with those big eyeballs. So I certainly understand where they're coming from. And if you're Georgia, you have to sort of do everything you can to prevent them from essentially becoming another Alabama and getting it to where they're at a place where they're just able to literally pick and select the best players in the country that want to come play for them.
I think that's true. Connor, good stuff. Thanks for being here. We'll see you this afternoon, 3 p.m. for our Cover 4 broadcast. You, me, Mike Griffith, Jeff Sentell, and a whole lot of fun. Last week, great surprise as Solomon Kinley joined us. You never know what you're going to see when you tune into a Cover 4 broadcast on Thursday afternoon. So we'll look forward to speaking to you then, Connor.
Yep. Thanks for having me on, BA.
All right, good stuff there from him. We'll kind of roll in, take a lot of your comments here on DawgNation Daily, presented by our friends at Merriweather and Tharp on the Georgia offensive line and what it looks like with some new guys in place this year, certainly a new coach. We'll have more on this in the podcast edition of our show there as well. I'll share with you what Isaiah Wilson's recently said about this group, what Andrew Thomas said about the role that Jamar Salyer has with all of this. So we'll do a lot of that on the podcast edition of DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. You can pick that up on all your podcast channels coming up in just a little bit. For now, it's your time to shine. We'll get your comments, and we'll talk about anything that you want to do here just for a moment. By the way, Bama Boy mentioned Jeremy Pruitt recruiting well in line. It would seem to get him another big commit here today. I gave credit for this, and I think I've done so in the video. I know I've done so on the podcast edition of our program, that as of right now, Pruitt's got a substantial amount of recruiting momentum. G. Gray says he thinks the Georgia fans ought to be worried about that. I would say the Georgia fans ought to be at least paying attention to it. The program that needs to be, I think, the most concerned about this is probably Florida, because Florida is trying to close the gap between Georgia and the SEC East, and no matter what Dan Mullen wants to try to do to disregard this, the way in which that happens is during the recruiting process. If you're not winning those recruiting battles against players that Georgia wants, you are not likely to beat Georgia on the field either. You're just not. Now, the Florida fan says, well, Dan Mullen's a better coach than Kirby Smart. Well, at some point in time, if that's true, then he's going to have to prove it, because head-to-head, the results from Mullen have not been very good against Kirby Smart teams. And, now he's at a place like Florida that in most situations ought to be competing on even footing with UGA. So it's Florida who needs to be the most concerned about this, because they're supposedly trying to close the gap on Georgia. But while they're trying to do that, the programs underneath them are also trying to close their own gap there as well. And I would say that Tennessee is doing more to close the gap with Florida than Florida is to close the gap with Georgia. That's my opinion anyway. All right, more of your comments. A couple more on YouTube, then we'll head over to Facebook here for a moment. Mike D says our offense will be just fine. Let the boys go out and play that backyard football. We've got size and speed everywhere. And I think that the speed part of this, Mike, is one of the most interesting things for me in terms of how Todd Monken asserts himself, because I think that in terms of the creativity of how you get that speed involved, that's where smart coaching shows up. Because obviously in the SEC, a speedy receiver, for instance, that can't get off the line of scrimmage is going to have a hard time getting open. So therefore, from a coaching standpoint, are there things that you can do to sort of coach that guy open? The rub routes, things like that. You've seen these things yourself. You don't have to be, a X's and O's coach yourself, expert to kind of understand that there are ways to get speedy players more open. And that's what I think that Georgia's got to do. I said this yesterday. Georgia's got a lot of top-end talent, but if you were forced to put those guys in one box or the other, you'd probably use the size box more so than the speed box. An example of that's George Pickens. George Pickens is a lot of things as a receiver, but if you all could only characterize him as one thing, you would say that he's a big receiver more so than a speedy receiver. Same thing for, like, say, a guy like Kendall Milton coming in as a true freshman. Milton is a dazzling array of highlights at the high school level, but if you were forced to put him in a box, he's more of a big back than he is a speedy back. There are other guys that are probably more the speed than the size, James Cook, Demetrius Robertson, guys like that. But ultimately, sometimes it can be a little harder to know how to use them. That's where coaching expertise hopefully comes in of how can you creatively get James Cook involved? How can you creatively get Demetrius Robertson involved? Georgia attempted to get D-Rob involved, especially second half of the season last year, especially in games late in the season which George Pickens wasn't on the field. They were trying to get Robertson involved, but for whatever reason, those attempts failed. Is there a more creative way to find him open? That kind of speed. The way that Alabama's used Jalen Waddle, as a for instance, on this. Although Waddle is a pretty impressive performer in his own right. Stephen Venanzi says, Cage and I were. How about this? Stephen played high school with Lawrence Cage. That's pretty interesting. He was always been a really good receiver, but definitely agree he struggled a bit at Miami. Undoubtedly was much better at Georgia. Yeah, it's really interesting that we would hear from people down in Miami who said, well, Cager's okay, whatever else. And like the one thing that I would come on the show last year and say, and listen, I get plenty wrong. I'm not telling you that I 100% predicted the success that Cager would enjoy when he was healthy at UGA. But the one thing I believe I said on this show, especially during our video comment section a good bit last year is the Cager caught 7 touchdowns in Miami. That's a fairly predictive stat. And I don't have the Trey McKitty stats in front of me, nor do I have them memorized. But when I've seen what he has done on a bad team, McKitty found a way to get used. So he's at least an interesting name worth considering for sure. And examining how Todd Monken might be interested in using him, I think is also pretty interesting. One of the interesting things about Monken is the last year he was a play caller, and some of y'all may actually be Bucks fans. You can tell me more about this, but when Monken was last a play caller, he didn't call plays for the Browns last season, but in 2018 he was calling plays in Tampa Bay. O.J. Howard at one point got hurt. Howard, of course, the former 5-star tight end from Alabama, now with the Tampa Bay Bucks. Bucks haven't always found a way to use O.J. Howard particularly effectively. That's kind of been the story for Howard's career, other than national championship games while playing with the Crimson Tide. But it seemed like Todd Monken had some success using Howard, and then O.J. eventually dealt with an injury there. So kind of comparing what Monken did with Howard in the moments in which Howard was healthy for Tampa Bay back in 2018, that might be a little bit predictive for how a guy like McKitty could be used in a Georgia offense. At least worth maybe taking a look at and thinking about that. Dennis Wilson's come out of the woodworks because I said Miami was a bad team. I think I actually said Florida State was a bad team, although I guess Miami with Cager probably wasn't a great team. But I'm glad to have Dennis here, stirring things up as usual. Let's see what's going on Facebook. Nick Vernon says, how about the freshman with the biggest impact? I vote for Darnell Washington. Imagine the huge end zone target. So I wonder if Washington fits the bill for me on that. I think that Darnell's upside for his career is obviously quite substantial. But ultimately, Georgia brought Trey McKitty in to use him. And the idea that McKitty, who's got as much experience as he has, is going to take a backseat to Washington, that wouldn't be my bet right now. The other thing I've said is I'm impressed when healthy with what Rylan Goody was able to do in a high school uniform. And with what I've seen from John Fitzpatrick, who's gotten more experience than you might realize thus far at Georgia. So I think that Goody and Fitzpatrick are still heard from in this tight end conversation. And I believe that Trey McKitty was brought here to be used. Not a statement to suggest that I'm not high on what Darnell Washington brings to the table. I am. I think that his upside for a career is pretty amazing. I think that Darnell Washington's high school career, though, was a good bit different than a guy like a Rick Gilbert, who played with a lot of other, elite college players, played with a college quarterback, was a part of a sophisticated offense that gave him some kind of ball skills, some receiving skills that he wouldn't have gotten on a less talented team. I don't know that Darnell Washington, who's also kind of a freakish athlete in that tight end category, I don't know that he could say the same thing out there in Las Vegas. So I think there may be a little bit of a learning curve for Washington to bring to the table. Washington's also a very big guy, dangerously big in some respects in terms of the kind of mobility you need to play the tight end position. So I would pick other freshmen before I got to Darnell. I would pick some of the other freshman wide receivers. Roseme's a name that I've talked about. Jermaine Burton is a name that the Jeff Sintel's been very high on with good reason. I think you talk about Justin Robinson a bit in this discussion because of the fact that Robinson's been on campus and had a chance to go through those Sugar Bowl practices already. That's been valuable experience. And, Robinson kind of brings that size quotient. He's the strong guy in that group. I sort of, think that gives him an opportunity there as well. So I would bet freshman receiver before I got to Darnell Washington. I'd also probably bet on Milton as the freshman running back, too. I think that Kendall has got a really good chance to be Georgia's second leading rusher this season. With all due respect to McIntosh and James Cook and others, I think that Kendall's going to get his shot. I think that he's going to come in ready to play. I think this is largely Zamir White's team in terms of the leading rusher for UGA. But I think that if Kendall Milton sort of steps into that typical number 2 role for Georgia, remember that was a 1,000-yard rusher for Elijah Holyfield in 2018. That was obviously a Sony Michel for Georgia in 2017. Georgia's second leading rusher is typically a pretty good player. If Kendall Milton has a similar contribution this year, then you're talking about a guy that's hard to eclipse in terms of impact freshman. So the offensive side of the ball, that's where I would go. I would go with Kendall Milton, and I would go with at least one of those wide receivers. And taste may vary in terms of who's the most likely to kind of thrive there in that spot. But I think it's a really good comment, though, Nick. Philip Jordan Wells upset that I spent so much time on YouTube. Sorry about that, Phil. Phil Rogers, a different Phil, says, just put D-Rob in the slot, run those jet sweeps, throw him the ball in the flats. Yeah, I think there's some of that. I mean, one of the things that I think that gets discounted is, and I don't know the numbers right here in front of me. You can do some research on this for yourself, and it's not that hard to find. Tua Tagovailoa, for as great as he was, and he was when he was healthy, especially playing against bad teams, Tua Tagovailoa was an amazing quarterback at Alabama. But a larger percentage of his passing yards than you might realize came on passes that were completed initially behind the line of scrimmage. Alabama found a way to get the ball to playmakers behind the line of scrimmage, near the line of scrimmage, at the line of scrimmage, let that guy make a man miss and make something happen. That was a real hallmark of the Alabama offense. I would say that's partially due to the creativity of the coaching staff, Kiffin in 17, Dable in 18, even Steve Sarkisian in recent years. And part of that was due to the overall athleticism of the wide receivers that Tua was delivering the football to. But a lot of big-time plays for Alabama have been on these, almost lateral type passing plays behind the line of scrimmage, jet sweep type stuff, something approximating what our commenter mentioned about Demetrius Robertson. Go back and rewatch the first half of the Notre Dame game. And many of you did do this a few weeks ago as part of the virtual G-Day that Kirby Smart attempted to stage. I think one of the things you see in that game is that Georgia also attempted to do some of that stuff at the line of scrimmage, and it just wasn't working. They were trying to kind of get the ball out to a playmaker, let him make a man miss, and then cut upfield for big vertical gains, and it just wasn't working for whatever reason. Either Notre Dame's sort of stepped up and was sound in the tackling game, or the play call wasn't quite creative enough, or maybe the athleticism wasn't quite prolific enough, whatever you want to sort of describe it to. But if you go back and sort of rewatch the first half of the Notre Dame game with a different eye, Georgia was trying to do then some of the stuff that we're right now saying they should, be doing more of in the future. And for whatever reason, it just didn't work. And at the time, in our forum at forum.dawgnation.com or in our post-game show, there was a lot of chatter of, well, Georgia was trying to be too horizontal. They weren't trying to be vertical enough. I was saying some of those same things myself. I'm not criticizing the people who criticized that at the time. I was saying some of those same things. But what's funny, though, is that there's also another way of looking at that, which that's what you're supposed to be doing. As I said before, a lot of Alabama's success offensively was with those kind of almost horizontal type plays, short, safe throws completed behind the line of scrimmage, or something that looks very much like a jet sweep with a Henry Ruggs, who had a lot of success at Alabama. Jalen Waddle doing some of those same kind of things. Devontae Smith, Jerry Jeudy, you know the names. So it's really kind of interesting that in some respects it seems like Georgia did try that. It just wasn't always working as well as we maybe would hope that it would. Miriam Martin Corbin says that she saw a blurb that students were coming back on campus at UGA. That's certainly the intended plan right now, and Georgia has spoke about that this week. A lot of schools have kind of said something similar. I have said that I believe that kind of hopeful, optimistic talk on the part of schools, I think, increases the likelihood that we're playing games in the fall, playing a season in the fall, not something that starts in the spring or the winter or some of the other things that have been talked about and kicked around. I know ESPN has had a big story in the last couple of days, but all the various possibilities that exist for college football, I just frankly right now don't take the notion of a spring season very serious. I don't take the notion of a winter season very serious. I believe the college football is going to be played in the fall. If I had to guess, I eventually think it's going to be played with some version of fans in the stands, although there's a lot of ground you got to cross to get there. That's obviously one of the huge variables because, look, the one thing that you see is people sort of find a way to make arguments in their own self-interest, and college football programs, athletic directors and such, university presidents that care about this kind of thing, there's a huge self-interest. If you're going to have a football game, you need to have fans in the stands because college football has, and it's been written about, even though some of the numbers have been exaggerated, a substantial amount of the revenue comes from ticket sales, more so than, like, say, the NFL, which is primarily driven by its television contract. So how do you bridge that gap between what we think we know now about the danger in public gatherings to what may happen at some point then? I don't know. I'm not quite as comfortable speculating about that, but I am a lot more comfortable saying that I believe there will be games this fall, and we'll find out if at some point in time that includes fans in the stands. Obviously, the return of professional sports this summer, NASCAR, PGA Tour, Major League Baseball, the sports that have been the most out in the open about this, that's going to be fanless for the foreseeable future. The other thing I'm not quite so certain about now, although I am fascinated to watch this play out, is the notion that some of the schools, some of the states that feel comfortable returning to football would do so without the rest of college football joining in. For instance, Georgia, part of the SEC, which is a part of the Power Five, but the governance around college football is relatively loose. It's not like, a lot of the other sports which are heavily sanctioned by the NCAA, things like that. College football, has just a good bit more autonomy built into the system. So, for instance, like the most aggressive state in terms of its sort of extended lockdowns is probably California. Is there a chance that states could just sort of move on with college football and leave California behind? I believe there at least is a strong possibility of that. There are all kinds of industries that have moved on from California. The movie industry, for instance. When was the last time you saw a movie that was actually filmed in Hollywood? They're filmed in Georgia. They're filmed in states like that. So if college football were to move on from California, it would make it all that different than a lot of other industries that have moved on from the Golden State there as well. So I have never felt more optimistic that we're heading towards a return to college football this fall. I guess the questions that linger for me: does that include fans at some point in time? And does that include everybody in the Power Five? The Group of Five, frankly, I don't care about. I'm sort of tired of watching other programs subsidize that level of play anyway. But for the Power Five programs, the Pac-12, portions of the ACC where you may have, more of a holdout, I'm sort of curious how much of what goes on includes those guys. So we'll see about that part of it. Chip Bromley, which mentions the state of Virginia, which is kind of involved in this. Obviously, Virginia is Georgia's week one opponent. And I guess in a roundabout way, Jack Swarbrick, the Notre Dame athletic director, because in the situation where you've maybe heard it spoken about where you'd only play conference games, you may have heard that discussed as a potential possibility. But the problem for like a Notre Dame or I guess Army would be in the same category as well. That's not in a conference. BYU. The problem for like independents is if the only thing you're playing is conference games, if you're not truly in a conference, then you technically don't have any games that are obviously going to be played. And so that's obviously an issue for Notre Dame. So Jack Swarbrick has said, well, if it's a delayed start to the season, maybe the only thing that's impacted is that it's like you just lose your first two games. And so if you can't start in like the middle of September, then you just sort of pick up in week 3 and the two teams you were scheduled to play in week 1 and week 2, you just don't play them. That's one of the thoughts that's been talked about. But, obviously, whereas Georgia's not currently scheduled to play a team from California, it is scheduled to play a team from Virginia. It's just way too early to understand how any of that's going to go. I mean, the only people pushing decisions to be made right now are sports writers who want something to write about. I think that Greg Sankey has been very good about this. I think he's in large way echoing what NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell has done, to proceed as if business is going to take place as usual, and then alter your plans at the time where it becomes necessary. That's what the SEC did for the basketball tournament, the other sports. Once it became obvious they couldn't play them, they stopped on a dime right before they were supposed to take place. So for now, proceed as if the season will begin, and then alter your plans when you get there. For instance, the SEC knew it couldn't have spring meetings in May in Destin, so they canceled those. However, SEC media days in July, maybe it can have them. So for now, it's going to proceed as if that's going to take place. And you'll make that change when you get there. The one thing for states like Virginia and others, if a huge number of states start reopening and making changes and things like that, it's going to become more difficult for the other states to draw a hard line. Is that the right decision or not? Not my place to say. There's a little bit of individual freedom associated with some of these, kinds of discussions. People need to make up their mind for themselves. But just practically speaking, if a lot of states start moving in one direction, I believe it's going to be harder for other states to kind of, hold their line in the sand. Bill Kelly says we need football. It's therapy. I do think to a degree that's true, that, sports just sort of make us feel normal. And I think one of the hardest things from a psychological standpoint, I don't mean like, psychiatrist's couch psychological. I mean just sort of that human psyche, our emotional feelings about life. I think one of the things that's made all of this so tough the last couple of months is the absence of sports has just made everything seem weirder. Now, ultimately, there are bigger problems in life than sports. Loss of health, loss of job that so many people are dealing with. That's more important than sports. But in terms of knowing how to frame some of those things, sports just provides a societal value in that regard. It makes us feel like things can get back to normal for the people who have dealt with uncertain health situations or uncertain career situations. Sports just makes people feel better, more optimistic about the future. The NFL draft did a great service, I think, in that regard this past week. So I do think that all of this demonstrates the societal value of sports. It's not the most important thing in the world, but sports has a way of helping us compartmentalize the things that are more important and understand how to, I guess, just sort of make the best of the situation no matter what we're dealing with. And from that standpoint, it's not an insignificant thing. A couple other things here. Let's see what else is going on. Try to get a couple more on Facebook here. Robert Barnes says they should start bringing the athletes in first and then with the students. I mean, I just think that the students coming back, so many other people have said that was like precursor for the players themselves coming back. And I just think that that's a signal that people feel okay about life on a university campus. The presence of those students returning when it happens at some point in time, I guess in the summer, just sort of makes you feel better about that. I'm really glad I'm not the one that has to make these decisions. I'm not sure what I would do. I don't know. I'm glad that my career puts me a lot farther down the trough than all of that, not to have to make that choice. It's a tough decision. And I think for the people on either side of the issue who have overly simplified the nature of the decision, I think they're doing everyone a disservice. I think there are a number of factors that makes all of this incredibly complicated. And hopefully the one thing that we do on this show, without getting into the reasons why it is complicated, hopefully we at least appreciate the fact that there are some complications associated with this. Let me get a couple more YouTubes and we're going to get ready to go. By the way, this is all part of our R.S. Andrews cool down. Air conditionings are back on, right? And if you're concerned yours might not be working, the R.S. Andrews cool down is certainly something to be thinking about there. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. R.S. Andrews does all of those things. And if your water heater goes out, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you the same day. If your air conditioning system is a little shaky, if you feel like it's on its last legs, get it tuned up, get it back to factory fresh specs. And if it's time to replace that, R.S. Andrews can do some good things for you there in that regard there as well. We love Darnell and the whole team over there because they love the kind of college football conversation we're able to have here every day. And boy, you better believe they're ready to see these football players back on the practice field getting ready for games again soon. That's why we love R.S. Andrews. Find them online at rsandrews.com. That's rsandrews.com. Couple of YouTube comments. George Herndon says, when the last date we can practice? That's the other thing that's kind of involved here is how much of a lead up to the start of the season do you need? Some coaches have said 4 weeks. Some coaches have said 8 weeks. The one thing I'm not that sensitive to, not that willing to hear is the idea that you can't start the season on time if you're not on campus 8 weeks before it begins. Part of me wants to say, suck it up and go out there. And the response to that's going to be, well, you're increasing the likelihood that the players are going to get hurt. If you can show me some real hard and fast data that suggests that's true, then I'll be happy to listen to you. But somehow I suspect this is a part of coaches trying to control the situation more so than it is based on, some idea that players are really in more danger of being hurt if they're not doing 8 weeks worth of conditioning before the season begins. But that's just my own personal opinion. Let me get a couple more here. Jay Shipes brings up a pretty good point. We'll make this our last comment. He says UGA is going to have to keep up fresh substitution mentality to keep all these playmakers from going to the transfer portal for playing time. It's one of the things that Kirby Smart very much believes in, and it does keep players happy. It keeps them more bought into what's going on. That's one of the reasons why when you run into like youth coaches and things like that like leave the same kid sitting on the bench all season long, like how could you justify doing that when Kirby Smart doesn't do that? Kirby Smart played 30-something guys, a fairly consistent number of snaps during the most recent season. Kirby's substituting at the big time college level more than some of these youth coaches do with some of their own teams, which is baffling to me. But nonetheless, that's something that Kirby believes in. Now, some of us sometimes get a little frustrated that maybe the right playmakers aren't playing enough offensively, but as the commenter said, there's a huge trade-off to this on the other side, that it provides the opportunity for for guys to continue to stay bought into the program. And by the way, with all of what's going on right now, with the uncertain return of practice, the uncertain conditioning of some of your players, the fact that you do have the capability of playing a lot of players, and the fact that you've shown a willingness to do that in the past, I do think is a bit of a positive for UGA. Thank you all for being a part of what we're doing here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Thought. We really appreciate them doing that. Yesterday, I forgot to do the Gator Hater Updater on video, so let me make sure I do that today. Our buddy Eddie would be very upset with me if I did not do that. So let me tell you, it's been 1,279 days, 1,279, since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. By the way, there is a great story involving another embarrassing social media. Can I use the word faux pas? Is that an okay word for me to use? Social media faux pas involving a Florida staffer, or at least an allegation against a Florida staffer on social media. We'll do that as part of the podcast edition of our show here coming up in just a couple of moments. Also, make sure you check out the AJC at ajc.com for your Atlanta news now. The shelter-in-place order for Georgia is set to expire here soon, and I guess there's uncertainty about what the future looks like. Is that extended? How are things going to change with that? Obviously, this is important stuff. It can be controversial. We stay away from the controversy, but the facts, the news itself, the AJC does a good job delivering that. It's important to know the facts as it impacts what we'll be doing this fall, whether it be students in school or college football on the field or anything else. So please check out the AJC.com for that. Stay up to date with your Atlanta news now. AJC.com, plenty of fallout continues in the NFL draft. Some really, really fun stuff in the sports section also there as well. AJC.com for your Atlanta news now. Y'all, thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. I'll say goodbye for now, but see you back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.